Nike didn't celebrate when it happened. There were no victory emails, no champagne moments, no executive speeches about a flawless rollout. What they saw first was alarms, systems lagging, inventory vanishing faster than internal dashboards could refresh. What was supposed to be a routine, rookie-branded drop turned into something that felt uncontrollable. Within minutes, it became obvious this wasn't normal demand. This was pressure, the kind that exposes whether a company actually understands the audience it claims to lead. And the most unsettling part wasn't how fast it sold out, it was how unprepared Nike was for just how deeply people cared. Because this wasn't driven by celebrity in the traditional sense. This wasn't fans chasing a highlight clip or riding a short-lived viral moment. What Nike underestimated was connection. When the SS Crown logo hit the public, it didn't feel like merchandise, it felt like permission. Gen Z buyers, international fans, fashion-forward consumers who couldn't tell you a quarterback rating if you asked them, all moved at once. The demand wasn't loud marketing noise, it was quiet certainty, the kind that says, "This belongs to me," before the brand even tells you why. And by the time Nike tried to regain control of the narrative, the story had already moved past them. For years, the industry believed it could manufacture relevance. If an athlete played well enough, long enough, brands would step in, polish the image, and guide the transition from prospect to icon. That model just cracked. What unfolded around Shedeur Sanders didn't follow the old timeline. He didn't wait to be crowned. He showed up with one already built. Not just a logo, but an identity people immediately recognized, trusted, and wanted to align with. Nike thought they were signing potential. What they actually encountered was leverage. And that's where the tension really starts, because when a brand like Nike misreads the moment, it's not just a bad forecast, it's a signal that the metrics are outdated, that the playbook still assumes control lives at the corporate level. This drop didn't ask for approval, it moved on instinct, on timing, on a cultural frequency Nike didn't fully tune into. And once that realization set in, the questions shifted fast, not about how much was sold, but about who was really driving the culture now. Because what happened next forced the entire industry to confront a reality it wasn't ready for. It started like any other release on paper, a clean rollout, controlled quantities, conservative projections, nothing that suggested panic or chaos. But the moment the SS Crown logo went live, the system buckled. Pages stalled, checkout queues froze, inventory numbers dropped so fast they became meaningless. In a matter of minutes, Nike wasn't tracking demand anymore, it was chasing it. What should have been a smooth digital launch turned into a stress test the company didn't know it was taking, and it failed in real time. 2 minutes was all it took for the site to feel the pressure. Not hours, not a gradual build, just a surge so immediate that internal safeguards couldn't keep up. Within 72 hours, stock was wiped clean across multiple regions. Restocks didn't stabilize anything, they vanished just as quickly, creating a loop of scarcity that only amplified the pull. This wasn't a slow burn hype cycle, it was ignition, the kind that leaves no room for correction once it's already started. Behind the scenes, this wasn't being framed as a win. Fulfillment teams were overwhelmed. Warehouses weren't built for this velocity from a rookie drop. Product leads were dragged into emergency calls trying to understand how something so contained spiraled so fast. The uncomfortable truth was setting in. This wasn't a logistics hiccup, it was a misread of cultural demand. Nike had planned for interest, what they encountered was belief. What made the situation even harder to control was how organic the spread felt. There wasn't a single moment to point to, no viral clip, no celebrity cosign that triggered the rush. The logo itself became the spark. The SS Crown moved through timelines, group chats, fashion pages, and international feeds without explanation. People weren't asking if they should buy, they were asking how fast they could get in before it disappeared again. That kind of urgency doesn't come from marketing copy, it comes from alignment. And as resellers jumped in, flipping pieces at multiples of the original price, the ripple effect only widened. Retailers wanted more stock, fans demanded restocks, social feeds filled with screenshots of sold-out pages like trophies. Each failed checkout made the logo feel more valuable. Each delay made the moment bigger. The system wasn't just overwhelmed, it was accidentally fueling the narrative it could no longer steer. But the chaos raised a sharper question inside Nike's walls. If the demand was this intense, this fast, and this widespread, what exactly had they signed up for? And more importantly, how badly had they underestimated the force they had just unleashed? If this were normal rookie hype, it would have followed a familiar pattern: a spike in interest, a short sellout window, a wave of posts, then silence. That's how these things usually go. A quick flash, then the market settles, and reality kicks back in. But what happened here didn't slow down. It compounded. Every restock disappeared faster than the last. Every mention created more pressure, not less. That's when it became clear this wasn't excitement burning itself out. It was momentum feeding on itself. Traditionally, rookie endorsements are built on projection. Brands sign early, keep exposure tight, and wait. The logic is simple: performance first, identity later. Signatures come after seasons, not before them. Cultural weight is something you earn once the resume is thick enough. That framework has survived decades because it usually works, but it assumes one critical thing: that the athlete is starting from zero in the public imagination. That assumption is exactly where Nike miscalculated, because the reaction to the SS crown didn't look like fans discovering someone new. It looked like fans finally getting access to something they were already invested in. People weren't testing the brand, they trusted it immediately. That's not how hype behaves. Hype needs reassurance. It needs constant reminders. This didn't. The moment the logo dropped, the audience moved with confidence, as if the decision had already been made long before the product ever existed. That's why Nike's original valuations started to look shaky almost overnight. Deals like this are usually priced cautiously, especially for players who haven't logged NFL snaps yet. The expectation is upside, not dominance, but reports began circulating that internal conversations shifted tone quickly. What started as a safe rookie endorsement now looked underpowered for the kind of cultural gravity it was generating, not because of numbers alone, but because of velocity. Growth like this isn't linear, and once it escapes that curve, it gets expensive to catch. What truly separated this from standard rookie buzz was how little external validation it needed. There was no waiting for analysts to approve it, no need for legacy voices to co-sign it. The audience didn't ask for permission from the league, the media, or the brand. They moved on instinct. That's a dangerous position for any company that relies on forecasting, because instinct doesn't show up in spreadsheets. By the time Nike saw the scale clearly, the moment had already outgrown the box it had been placed in. And that realization forced a harder truth into the open. This wasn't about overselling a hoodie, it was about underestimating the starting point. Whatever Nike thought they were investing in, public clearly saw something bigger, something already formed, which raised the next question no one inside the building could ignore: where did that belief come from in the first place? Long before the contract ink dried, there was already a sense of familiarity around Shedeur Sanders. Not the forced kind that comes from nonstop exposure, but the quieter kind that builds when someone controls how they're seen instead of flooding the feed. His presence didn't feel rushed. It felt intentional. Every appearance, every clip, every quote carried the same tone: calm, confident, and unbothered. That consistency mattered. By the time a logo ever appeared, people felt like they already knew who he was, and more importantly, what he stood for. What separated Sanders from most young athletes was that his identity wasn't reactive. He wasn't adjusting to attention as it came. He had already defined himself before the spotlight fully hit. There was no scramble to create a persona once eyes turned his way, no overcorrection, no forced relatability. He moved like someone who understood that attention is fragile and that the fastest way to lose it is to chase it. So instead, he let presence do the work, and that restraint made everything feel heavier when it finally landed. The SS Crown logo didn't. Public clearly saw something bigger, something already formed, which raised the next question no one inside the building could ignore: where did that belief come from in the first place? Long before the contract ink dried, there was already a sense of familiarity around Shedeur Sanders. Not the forced kind that comes from non-stop exposure, but the quieter kind that builds when someone controls how they're seen instead of flooding the feed. His presence didn't feel rushed. It felt intentional. Every appearance, every clip, every quote carried the same tone: calm, confident, and unbothered. That consistency mattered. By the time a logo ever appeared, people felt like they already knew who he was, and more importantly, what he stood for. What separated Sanders from most young athletes was that his identity wasn't reactive. He wasn't adjusting to attention as it came. He had already defined himself before the spotlight fully hit. There was no scramble to create a persona once eyes turned his way, no overcorrection, no forced relatability. He moved like someone who understood that attention is fragile and that the fastest way to lose it is to chase it. So instead, he let presence do the work, and that restraint made everything feel heavier when it finally landed. The SS Crown logo didn't introduce a new version of him. It confirmed one that already existed. That's why it didn't feel like merch. It felt like a marker, a symbol that aligned perfectly with the way he carried himself on and off the field. Clean, direct, controlled. There was no disconnect between the image on the product and the person behind it. For an audience that's grown skeptical of polished branding and manufactured narratives, that alignment read as authenticity, and authenticity travels fast. Trust was the real currency here. Sanders had built it quietly, long before anyone tried to monetize it. His audience didn't feel marketed to because they weren't. They felt included, like they were watching something develop in real time without being asked to buy in prematurely. So when the moment finally came, the buying didn't feel transactional. It felt symbolic. Wearing the logo wasn't about supporting a rookie, it was about signaling alignment with a mindset. And that's what made Nike's position so complicated. Brands are used to shaping identity after the deal is signed. In this case, the identity showed up already formed, fully functional, already resonating. The contract didn't create the gravity, it stepped into it, which meant the power dynamics were already different from the start. And once that became clear, everything else about this story began to make a lot more sense. Branding can carry attention, but performance decides whether it survives. That's where the margin for error usually shows up. When a young player arrives with this much visibility, the game tends to catch up quickly. One bad outing, one shaky stretch, and the story flips. Skepticism creeps in. Critics start sharpening angles. That safety net, the benefit of the doubt, disappears fast. But that moment never came for Shedeur Sanders. Instead, the opposite happened. From the start, his play removed the exit ramp for doubters. The reads were sharp, the tempo was controlled, decision-making under pressure looked seasoned, not rushed. What analysts had once hinted at, that the image might be ahead of the ability, started to dissolve snap by snap. There was nothing flashy to hide behind, no gimmick to deflect attention, just execution. And that mattered because it forced the conversation to stay honest. You could question the branding, you couldn't question the quarterbacking. As the performances stacked up, the narrative shifted quietly but decisively. Commentators who once framed him as a personality with potential began recalibrating in real time. The language hanged. Less skepticism, more curiosity, then genuine respect. That progression is rare, especially this early. It usually takes time for perception to catch up to reality. Here, reality dragged perception forward with it. Every clean drive added weight to the identity that had already been built off the field. What made the alignment so effective was how seamless it felt. The way he played mirrored the way he presented himself. Calm under pressure, economical with motion, no wasted energy. The brand didn't exaggerate the athlete, it reflected him. That synchronicity is almost impossible to fake, and audiences pick up on it instantly. There were no moments that made people second-guess the belief they'd already bought into, no awkward disconnect between image and output. Everything pointed in the same direction. And in doing so, Sanders eliminated the most common failure point in modern athlete branding. There was no drop-off where hype outpaced ability, no lull where performance lagged behind expectation. The story didn't stall because the results didn't either, which meant the momentum didn't need protection, it sustained itself. And once the league and the audience realized there was no safety net left to pull away, the focus shifted again, because now this wasn't just working, it was scaling. Once performance locked in credibility, the reach expanded beyond anything football alone could explain. The SS Crown stopped behaving like sports merchandise and started moving like a lifestyle signal. It showed up in places that had nothing to do with box scores or game recaps. Fashion timelines picked it up, style accounts reposted it, international feeds treated it less like a team accessory and more like a design piece. The shift was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. This wasn't fans wearing gear, it was people styling identity. What stood out immediately was who was buying in, not just die-hard football followers, not just men. Women were driving demand. International buyers were clearing inventory in regions where American football barely registers culturally. Markets across Europe and parts of Asia surged without any traditional push. No localized campaigns, no tailored messaging, just resonance. That kind of crossover doesn't happen because of league exposure. It happens when a symbol translates without explanation. The SS Crown worked visually, but it landed emotionally. It didn't scream allegiance to a team or a moment in sports history. It represented something broader: control, confidence, self-definition. Those ideas travel easily across borders. Someone didn't need to know a stat line to understand the feeling the logo carried. That's why it slid so naturally into fashion and lifestyle spaces. It didn't ask to be contextualized, it stood on its own. For Nike, this introduced a new level of complexity. Their systems are built around region-specific demand, predictable sports cycles, and controlled distribution. This broke that logic. Suddenly, supply chains were reacting to interest in places that weren't forecasted at all. Global teams had to adjust in real time, shifting focus and inventory priorities on the fly. Sanders wasn't just moving product, he was rerouting attention. What makes this kind of global pull so rare is that it usually comes later, once an athlete becomes an icon. Here, it showed up early, fully formed. The brand didn't grow outward from football, it hovered above it, pulling from culture, aesthetics, and personality first, then anchoring back to the sport. That reversal is what caught everyone off guard. The SS Crown didn't represent fandom, it represented belonging. And once that belonging crossed borders, the story shifted again. Because now, this wasn't just about a rookie changing expectations inside football. It was about forcing the industry to admit that cultural relevance doesn't wait for permission and it doesn't stay contained. Inside Nike, the tone changed fast. What looked public-facing like a runaway success felt very different behind closed doors. This wasn't a victory lap, it was triage. Fulfillment teams were stretched thin, warehouses were struggling to keep pace, and product leads were pulled into emergency conversations that weren't on the calendar a week earlier. The real issue wasn't the sellouts, it was the realization that the company hadn't built its internal machinery for this kind of velocity from a rookie. The systems assumed patience, the market showed none. Reports began to surface that Nike was reevaluating how the deal had been structured, not out of regret, but out of urgency. What was originally framed as a standard rookie endorsement now looked misaligned with reality. The value assigned early on didn't reflect the scale of cultural pull that had just been revealed. Internally, this created pressure not just to restock product, but to reassess the relationship itself. When demand exposes a gap that wide, it stops being a marketing problem and becomes a strategic one. The aftershock rippled outward immediately. Competitors weren't watching casually anymore. Executives at Adidas and Puma reportedly shifted posture almost overnight. Younger signings were pushed higher on priority lists. Launch timelines were compressed. Lifestyle appeal started carrying more weight in scouting conversations. The goal wasn't to replicate Sanders, it was to avoid missing the next one. Because once this kind of moment passes, there's no way to reverse engineer it. What made brands uneasy wasn't just the speed, it was the loss of narrative control. Nike is used to setting the tone, guiding the story, rolling out meaning on its own terms. Here, the story ran ahead of them. By the time press teams adjusted messaging, the public conversation had already evolved. Fans weren't waiting to be told what the logo meant, they'd assigned meaning themselves. That's a dangerous position for any corporation that relies on storytelling as leverage. This wasn't about losing market share in the short term, it was about watching the rules shift in real time. If a rookie could step into the league with this level of cultural force, then the old developmental model was officially fragile. Brands could no longer afford to wait 5 seasons for relevance to appear. The panic wasn't visible on the surface, but it was there, in faster approvals, tighter timelines, and a growing awareness that the ground had moved. And while companies scrambled to adjust, Sanders stayed silent, letting the momentum do the talking. That restraint only sharpened the imbalance, because while the industry rushed to keep up, he was already operating on a different clock, one where the work, the identity, and the brand were moving as a single system. While brands scrambled and analysts debated, Sanders never looked rushed. There was no victory tour, no over-explanation. Instead, the message stayed quiet and consistent. The work comes first. Practice clips surfaced not as promotions, but as windows. Long throws, film sessions, reps that didn't need captions to feel intentional. Nothing flashy, nothing forced, just preparation on display. And that's what gave the brand its weight. It wasn't talking, it was showing. What made this approach land was how seamlessly it aligned with everything else. The same control people saw in his on-field decision-making showed up in how he documented the process. No dramatized edits, no exaggerated energy, just clean visuals of discipline and focus. The brand wasn't talking, it was showing. Layered on top of the work, it was embedded in it. When Sanders said the work wasn't separate from the brand, it didn't sound like a line, it sounded like a principle. Fans noticed the difference immediately. These weren't ads masquerading as content, they felt like access. Like being allowed into the routine instead of being sold a polished outcome. That transparency does something powerful. It turns belief into trust. When people see the effort consistently, the logo stops feeling like a product and starts feeling like a byproduct, something earned, not engineered. Even his public tone reinforced the same philosophy. Post-game interviews stayed grounded, confident but never performative. He acknowledged the attention without feeding it. That restraint mattered. In a media landscape built on overselling, underplaying becomes its own statement. Sanders didn't need to elevate the logo verbally because the process behind it was already visible. The credibility was baked in. This is where the gap between him and typical rookies became impossible to ignore. Most athletes learn how to manage hype after it arrives. Sanders treated hype like something that could be neutralized with consistency. By anchoring everything back to the work, he removed volatility from the equation. There were no wild swings in tone because there were no shortcuts being taken. And that's what ultimately made the brand feel durable. Anyone can have a moment. Very few can sustain one without forcing it. By making preparation the centerpiece, Sanders ensured that every new clip, every game, every quiet training video reinforced the same idea. The brand wasn't demanding attention, it was accumulating respect, and that respect was about to change how fans showed up altogether. The shift became impossible to ignore once the cameras panned to the stands. More SS Crown logos than team colors, more player identity than franchise allegiance. Fans weren't just supporting a roster anymore, they were representing a person. That crossover is rare, and when it happens this early, it rattles the hierarchy of how professional sports are supposed to work. Team-first culture has always been the backbone of the league, but suddenly, the crowd was telling a different story. People showed up wearing Sanders' logo not as merch, but as a statement.
It wasn't tied to a win-loss record or a specific game. It traveled independently of the scoreboard. That's the key difference. Team loyalty is situational. Player identity, when done right, becomes portable. Fans could wear the SS crown anywhere, to games, to events, on social feeds, without it feeling like niche sports gear. It functioned the way streetwear does, signaling taste, mindset, and alignment. This kind of fan behavior sends shockwaves through the league. The NFL has always been structured around franchises as the primary brands. Players were stars, but the shield came first. When fans start prioritizing a player's symbol over a team's logo, that balance tilts. Stadium vendors notice, corporate sponsors notice, teams notice, because now attention isn't automatically theirs to command. What Sanders tapped into was a deeper desire for belonging. Younger audiences don't just want to cheer, they want to participate. They want to identify with something that feels personal, not inherited. A team brand is handed down, a player brand feels chosen. The SS crown gave fans something to rally around that didn't require decades of history or regional loyalty. It offered immediacy, relevance, and meaning in real time. And this wasn't just a visual trend, it was behavioral. Social feeds filled with fan fits built around the logo. People styled it, remixed it, made it their own. That level of engagement is gold in modern
branding, and it can't be mandated. It has to be invited. Sanders didn't ask fans to represent him. He built something they wanted to carry. Once that line was crossed, the implications became clear. This wasn't a one-off aesthetic win. It was a signal that influence had shifted closer to the individual. The league still mattered, the teams still mattered, but the center of gravity moved. And when a rookie can do that, not by demanding loyalty, but by earning identification, it forces everyone to reconsider where power really lives in the modern sports ecosystem. Because from here on out, the question isn't whether teams are still important, it's how often they'll find themselves sharing the spotlight with players who arrive already bigger than the uniform they're wearing. What this moment exposed isn't just a successful drop or a perfectly timed rise. It exposed a crack in the foundation of how athlete value has been calculated for decades. The old playbook assumed patience, hierarchy, and control. Play well first, build relevance later, let brands guide the transformation. That sequence no longer holds. What happened here proved that cultural influence can arrive fully formed, and when it does, it doesn't wait for permission to scale. This wasn't about chasing trends or forcing virality, it was about meaning. People didn't rally around the SS crown because it was everywhere. They rallied because it represented something they recognized: discipline, confidence, ownership, and follow-through. In a landscape flooded with branding attempts that feel hollow, that authenticity cut through immediately. And once it did, no amount of traditional gatekeeping could slow it down. For the industry, that's the uncomfortable truth. Performance still matters, but relevance matters just as much. Timing matters, identity matters, the ability to connect without explanation matters. Shedeur Sanders didn't just execute on the field, he understood the moment he was stepping into and met it head-on with clarity. That combination is rare, and it's why this story feels bigger than one contract or one season. Brands are adjusting in real time now, not because they want to innovate, but because they have to. Waiting is no longer safe. Underestimating the starting point is no longer acceptable. The next generation of athletes won't be introduced, they'll arrive, with platforms, audiences, and identities already intact. Those who recognize that shift early will benefit. Those who don't will be left reacting, just like Nike was. And that's what makes this more than hype. It's a case study unfolding in real time, a reminder that control has shifted closer to the individual and that audiences reward consistency over polish. The playbook wasn't updated, it was broken. And while the industry rushes to rewrite it, Sanders is already moved on, with fans across every time zone wearing the proof that the future of sports branding doesn't come later anymore. It shows up fully formed right at the start.